In the last section, we discussed exactly how Redux promise unwraps a promise for us so that we only have to work with data in our reducers, not promises. Let's go ahead and work with that data now inside of our weather reducer. First, we need to figure out what part of the request we want to save. Let's flip back over to our console here and take a look at the action that's coming in. So this is from the last section when we were console logging the action that was coming in. And we console logged it and we saw the payload here. If we look at the payload here carefully, we've got this config object, we've got some headers and status text. We don't really care about any of that request data. The only thing we really care about here is the data object in here. This is the thing that contains the city and the list that contains all of our forecasts. So anytime that we get a fetch weather action that comes in, the only piece of data that we really care about is action.payload.data. That's the only thing we care about. All right, next thing we need to do is decide what our initial state for be, or what our data structure for our weather state should be. A user can query for many different cities by entering one city and then searching for another and searching for another. And thinking back to our initial mocks for this project, which I've still got up right here, we want to show multiple rows from multiple cities at a time. So that implies that we're going to have a data structure for our state here that's going to be kind of a list of sorts. So as you might imagine, we're probably going to want to store all of these pieces of weather data in an array. So rather than having an initial state of null, we'll have an initial state of an array instead. Next thing we need to do is set up a switch statement in here to handle only the fetch weather action type. We'll set up our switch statement by writing switch action.type. And then we need a case in here, and we need to know what the action type that we specifically care about. So this is where, if you recall, we spoke briefly about the fetch weather type being declared in here. This is where we're going to make use of that. Instead of just typing the string fetch weather, fetch weather, like so, this is something that's really brittle. It's really fragile. If I accidentally delete this R right here, now all of a sudden, this action right here that is supposed to map up with this case right here, they're not going to map up anymore because they've got different strings, right? So to handle that, a little bit of annoyance, who knows when that's going to come out and bite you, we assigned that type to the constant fetch weather and we exported it from this file. So we'll go ahead and import that inside of our weather reducer now and make use of that as our case type. So we will import fetch weather from, and we're in reducers, we'll go up into actions and then index. So we're up into actions and then index. So we'll do case fetch weather. Now again, we can change this string right here all we want, but both the action and the reducer that cares about it are referencing the same string, so no problem, we can make typos all day. Okay. So now that we're inside of here, we need to handle the payload. So we'll return in an array action.payload.data. Remember, we're putting this inside of an array because we're going to have multiple cities coming back here. And we also just discussed why we're taking payload.data. Only this data property right here has the data that we actually care about. It has the city and the list of the forecast objects as well. We don't care about like payload.headers or payload.status or any of those other properties. There's just one property from what we have here right now. When we search for a city, it'll return it. We'll get this return action payload data inside of an array. But we aren't actually collecting cities, right? If a user searches for another city, we'll return a new array with only that new city. We're not like collecting cities over time. We're not building a list. We still only have the concept of one searchable city, one active city at a time. So what we need to do here is say take the current state, take our current list of cities and add this new city, action.payload data, to it. So we need to add on to the existing state, not replace the existing state entirely. So when we try to do that, we'll end up doing something like, maybe state.push action.payload.data. Now, before, I'm going to tell you right now, this is kind of like your natural inclination. Okay, no problem. We need to collect cities over time. So as a user searches for more cities, just push it into our existing state right here. This right here, this line of code that we have, is opening up a huge can of worms, believe it or not. And this is probably something that's one of the most subtle traps inside of all of Redux. Something that we discussed when we were covering React earlier, when we were covering React, and we covered the topic of state in a React component. You'll recall that I said very emphatically, never ever call or say something like this.state.text equals blah, blah, blah. Never set state equal to something, right? We only update state by calling set state. That is completely true of Redux as well. We don't ever manipulate state directly, and that's what's happening here. We've got this existing array, state, and we are changing that array. We're mutating it. We're mutating that array in place. Whenever we're inside of a reducer like this, we don't mutate our state. We return a completely new instance of state. So instead of writing state.push, we need to return a new array entirely that includes all of the old weather data and the new piece of weather data. So one approach to make this happen might be something like, instead of doing a push, we'll concat the existing array of cities with a new array that contains our new city right here. Concat doesn't change the existing array, it creates a new array that contains all the old stuff and the new stuff in here. So this right here would be a much better approach. We aren't mutating our state, we're returning a new version of our state. Super key in Redux. And a very easy trap to fall into is to accidentally mutate your state over time. Always make sure that you are returning a new instance of state. So anyways, state.concat right here works well. It's going to work for us. But there's a little piece of ES6 syntax that we can take to approach this in a slightly different way. Instead of writing state.concat, we can write return action.payload.data and then ... state. So these two lines that we have right here are nearly completely identical. They say make a new array, put action.data inside of it, and then take this other variable, which, because of these three dots, says, oh yeah, this might be an array, so take all of the entries inside of it and insert it into this new outside array. So kind of like flatten it out for us a little bit. This will end up with an array that looks like, state or city, city, city. It does not end up with something that looks like city and then new array, city, city, like so. So this is a nice little, very compact way of creating a new array, which is what we always want to do with our state, as opposed to mutating it. It's totally up to you which approach you want to take. Do note that by doing action.payload.data and then comma the rest of the stuff, we insert the new record at the top or the very front of the array. And we can easily do that with the concat by swapping the two entries here as well if we wanted to. Okay, so one last time, just to reiterate, absolutely key in Redux, we never want to manipulate our state, which is what we would have done if we did something like state.push action.payload.data. It would have manipulated the existing array. Instead, we create an entirely new array and return that instead. Okay, so we've now wired up our reducer here. We've got it added to our application under the combine reducers. Let's go ahead and test it out in the next section by making a new component to render a list of cities. I'll see you there.